The space station loomed ahead like a forgotten relic, its steel hull scarred by countless years of neglect and conflict. Elias Vren's boots echoed off the grimy metal floor as he moved through the station's underbelly, his hand resting on the blaster at his side. The air reeked of fuel, sweat, and desperation. A perfect place for a man looking to disappear. He wasn't here by choice. His contact had insisted this meeting would be worth the trouble, though Elias doubted it. He was too old for games, his days of glory long behind him, leaving him with nothing but scars and regrets. Yet, the promise of a lucrative weapons deal was enough to draw him into this festering pit. The marketplace was a cacophony of shouted bargains and the hum of machinery, but Elias's sharp eyes caught something unusual. A small crowd gathered in the shadows beyond the main thoroughfare. Curious, he pushed through the throng, keeping his hood low. What he saw made his stomach churn. A makeshift stage had been set up, and atop it stood a figure in chains. She was unlike anyone Elias had ever seen. Her skin was a shimmering shade of blue, marked by delicate patterns of bioluminescent tattoos that pulsed faintly, matching the rhythm of her breathing. Her eyes, large and filled with a quiet defiance, swept over the crowd. Even in captivity, she held herself with a dignity that contrasted sharply with the brutish auctioneer beside her. "Behold, a rare gem from the Elysian Nebula," the auctioneer bellowed. "Her kind are said to bring luck and prosperity to their masters. Starting bid, 50,000 credits," the crowd murmured, some already raising their hands to bid. Elias's jaw tightened. He knew better than to get involved, but something about the girl's calm yet piercing gaze unsettled him. She didn't beg or plead. She simply stood there, waiting, as if she knew someone would come for her. The bidding climbed higher. Elias clenched his fists, the weight of his blaster suddenly heavier at his side. He wasn't a hero, hadn't been for a long time, but leaving her here felt wrong. Before he could think it through, a shout erupted behind him. "You double-crossing bastard!" Elias spun just in time to see his contact lunging toward him, a knife gleaming in his hand. The man's face was twisted in rage. "You thought you could cheat me?" Elias barely dodged the first strike, his reflexes kicking in. He drew his blaster and fired, the shot echoing through the chamber. Chaos erupted as bystanders scattered, screams filling the air. The auctioneer barked orders, and a group of armed guards rushed forward. "Time to go," Elias muttered, ducking behind a crate as blaster fire zipped past him. He glanced back at the stage. The girl stood frozen, her tattoos flashing rapidly, a clear sign of distress. "Damn it," Elias growled. He fired a few more shots to keep the guards at bay, then bolted toward the stage. The auctioneer drew a weapon, but Elias was faster. One well-placed shot sent the man sprawling. The girl stared at him as he reached her, her glowing tattoos now a steady, urgent pulse. Up close, her presence was even more striking. Elias didn't have time to think about it. He pulled a knife from his belt and slashed through her chains. "Come on," he shouted. She hesitated only for a second, then leapt down from the stage with surprising agility. Together, they raced through the chaos, dodging blaster fire and pushing through the panicked crowd. Elias led her toward the docks where his ship waited, his heart pounding as adrenaline surged through his veins. "Keep moving," he urged, firing over his shoulder. The girl kept pace, her glowing tattoos lighting the dim corridors as they ran. They reached the hangar just as more guards poured in. Elias hit the controls to seal the bay doors, buying them precious seconds. He gestured toward his freighter, an old but reliable vessel that had seen him through countless scrapes. "Get inside," he barked. The girl didn't argue. She climbed the ramp, her eyes scanning the ship's interior with cautious curiosity. Elias followed, slamming the hatch shut and locking it. He barely had time to catch his breath before he was in the cockpit, powering up the engines. Blaster fire rang out against the hull as the ship lifted off. The girl appeared in the doorway, gripping the frame for balance as the freighter shot into space. Her tattoos shimmered softly now, their glow calming as the immediate danger passed. Elias set the autopilot and turned to face her. You all right? She nodded, though her expression remained guarded. Up close, her features were delicate yet otherworldly. She studied him with a quiet intensity, her luminous eyes seeming to take in every detail. I don't know what kind of mess I just got myself into, Elias muttered, running a hand through his graying hair. But I couldn't just leave you there. The girl stepped closer, her glowing tattoos shifting in color. Slowly, she reached out, her hand brushing against his. Elias felt a strange warmth spread through him, a sensation both calming and electrifying. Her touch was light, almost hesitant, but there was an undeniable connection in that brief contact. You saved me, she said softly. Her voice was melodic, carrying an accent that hinted at faraway stars. I owe you my life. Elias shook his head. You don't owe me anything. I've done enough bad in my time. Maybe this evens the scales a little. She tilted her head, her eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to decipher his words. Then, her tattoos brightened again, this time in a soft, comforting hue. She stepped back, folding her hands in front of her. My name is Escheril, she said. Elias, he replied, offering a faint smile. Welcome aboard. For the first time, her expression softened, and a small, tentative smile crossed her lips. The tension in the room eased, but Elias knew their troubles were far from over. Whoever had been running that auction wouldn't let them go so easily. They were fugitives now, and the galaxy was a dangerous place for anyone willing to stand against the powerful. Elias leaned back against the console, his mind already racing with plans for their next move. The weight of their situation pressed down on him, but for now they were safe. And as he met Escheril's glowing gaze, he felt a strange, unspoken resolve settle between them. The journey ahead would be fraught with peril, but at least they wouldn't face it alone. The hum of the freighter's engines filled the cabin as Elias navigated through the vast expanse of space. He glanced at the navigation console, his eyes flicking to the small blinking dot on the radar. They were still in the clear, but he knew it wouldn't last. Whoever had been behind the slave auction wouldn't let Escheril go without a fight. He let out a low sigh, running a hand over the stubble on his jaw. Behind him, Escheril stood silently, her luminous tattoos casting a soft glow in the dim light. She had remained quiet since they had escaped, her eyes fixed on the stars streaking past the viewport. Elias could only imagine what she had been through. Her kind was rare, hunted, and prized. The weight of it pressed down on him. You should rest, he said without turning around. We've got a long haul ahead. Escheril didn't respond immediately. Instead, she took a hesitant step closer, her presence more felt than heard. You saved me, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Why? Elias leaned back in his seat, folding his arms. Guess I've seen enough people hurt to know when it's time to step in. Her eyes searched his face, her bioluminescence shifting to a calm, steady blue. You risked your life for someone you don't know. Elias shrugged, his voice gruff. Maybe I was just tired of looking the other way. For a moment, silence stretched between them, broken only by the quiet hum of the ship. Then, Escheril stepped closer, her hand hovering near his arm. She hesitated, her tattoos flickering faintly, before gently placing her hand on his. Her touch was light, her skin cool and smooth, but it sent a ripple of warmth through Elias that caught him off guard. You don't have to carry it alone, she said softly. Elias looked down at her hand, then up into her eyes. The weight of her words lingered, pulling at something deep within him. He gave a small nod and rose from his seat. Come on, let's get you settled. He led her through the narrow corridors of the ship to the small living quarters. The space was cramped but functional, with a bunk, a table, and a storage locker. Escheril's gaze wandered over the room, her expression unreadable. She moved to the bunk, sitting carefully on the edge, her hands resting in her lap. Not much, but it'll do, Elias said, leaning against the doorframe. You'll be safe here. She nodded, her tattoos dimming slightly as her shoulders relaxed. Thank you. Elias watched her for a moment, then pushed off the frame. Get some rest. I'll be in the cockpit if you need anything. As he turned to leave, Escheral's voice stopped him. Elias. He glanced back, meeting her gaze. The soft glow of her tattoos pulsed gently, and for the first time, there was a flicker of vulnerability in her expression. I've never been free, she said quietly. I don't know what comes next. Elias's grip tightened on the doorframe. We figure it out, he said simply. One step at a time. She offered a faint smile, her eyes shimmering in the low light. Elias gave her a curt nod and left, his mind churning as he made his way back to the cockpit. Hours passed as the freighter drifted through space. Elias kept his eyes on the radar, his thoughts wandering. He'd been alone for so long, accustomed to the silence and the weight of his past. But now, with Escheril aboard, the solitude felt different. Less a burden, more a shared quiet. He didn't hear her approach until she was standing beside him. He turned, surprised to see her out of the bunk. Couldn't sleep? He asked. She shook her head, her tattoos flickering softly. It's hard to find peace when you've been running for so long. Elias nodded in understanding. Yeah, I know the feeling. Escheril moved closer, her gaze drawn to the stars outside the viewport. They're beautiful, she murmured. Dangerous too, Elias replied. But yeah, they've got their moments. She looked at him, her eyes catching the faint light from the console. You see the danger in everything. Comes with the territory, Elias said with a smirk. Keeps me alive. Escheril tilted her head slightly, her expression thoughtful. And what keeps you human? Elias blinked, caught off guard by the question. Before he could answer, Escheril reached out, her fingers brushing against his arm. The touch was light, but it carried a weight that made his pulse quicken. Her tattoos shifted to a warm, golden hue, the light spreading softly between them. In my culture, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, we share our light with those we trust. It's how we connect, how we understand each other. Elias felt the warmth of her touch seep into him, a quiet intensity that seemed to fill the space between them. He hesitated, then placed his hand gently over hers. Her light brightened, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. I've spent a long time not trusting anyone, Elias admitted, his voice rough. But you're different. Escheril's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. We both are. The moment stretched, charged with a quiet intimacy that neither of them moved to break. Then, as if sensing the need to pull back, Escheril let her hand fall, her tattoos dimming slightly. Elias exhaled, leaning back in his seat. We've got a lot of ground to cover, he said, his tone lighter. But for now, we stick together. Escheril nodded, her gaze lingering on him for a moment longer. Together, she echoed. The ship's console beeped, drawing their attention. Elias leaned forward, his expression hardening. Looks like we've got company. Escheril's tattoos flared briefly, her posture straightening. Who? Could be anyone, Elias said grimly. But something tells me they're not here to welcome us. He glanced at her, his resolve firm. Get ready. This ride's about to get rough. Escheril gave a determined nod, her glow intensifying. Elias set his jaw, his hands moving swiftly over the controls. They were far from safe, but for the first time in years, Elias felt a spark of hope. Together, they might just have a chance. The freighter's engines whined softly as it touched down on a remote, desolate moon. A thick layer of mist clung to the rocky surface, shrouding the landscape in an eerie, perpetual twilight. The only sign of civilization was a cluster of low, metal structures huddled together near a jagged cliff. This was a haven for the galaxy's unwanted, a place where fugitives and outcasts could disappear. Elias powered down the ship, his fingers lingering over the controls for a moment before he leaned back in his seat. He glanced at Escheril, who stood beside him, her glowing tattoos dim and subdued. She was watching the settlement through the viewport, her expression a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. This place doesn't look like much, Elias said, breaking the silence. But it's safe enough for now. Escheril turned to him, her bioluminescence flickering faintly. Will they help us? Elias gave a small shrug. Depends. Most folks here don't ask questions as long as you've got something to trade. She nodded, her gaze returning to the misty landscape. And if they ask about me? They won't, Elias said firmly. But if they do, we keep it vague. The less they know, the better. He stood and grabbed his blaster, securing it at his side. Stay close. We'll find someone who can help us refuel and lay low for a bit. Escheril followed him down the ramp, her bare feet silent against the cold metal. As they stepped onto the rocky surface, the chill of the moon's atmosphere hit them, and she instinctively drew closer to Elias. Her warmth was subtle but comforting, a quiet reminder of her presence. The settlement's main building was a dimly lit cantina, its neon sign flickering intermittently. Inside, the air was thick with smoke and the low hum of conversation. The patrons, an eclectic mix of aliens and humans, barely glanced at Elias and Escheril as they entered. This was a place where no one cared who you were as long as you didn't bring trouble. Elias led Escheril to a corner booth, his eyes scanning the room for any signs of danger. He caught the attention of the barkeep, a grizzled old man with cybernetic eyes, and gestured for drinks. When the man approached with 2 metal cups of murky liquid, Elias slid a few credits across the table. We're looking for someone who deals in fuel and supplies, Elias said quietly. Discreetly, the barkeep eyed him for a moment, then gave a small nod. Try the mechanic in the back. Name's Marlowe. Keeps to himself, doesn't ask questions. Thanks, Elias said, taking a sip of the drink. It burned on the way down, but he didn't flinch. Escheril watched him, her hands wrapped around her cup though she didn't drink. Her tattoos pulsed faintly, reflecting her unease. Do you trust him? She asked softly. Elias set the cup down. Trust isn't the right word, but people here value their privacy. As long as we don't give them a reason to dig, we'll be fine. She nodded, though her gaze lingered on the other patrons. Elias could see the tension in her posture, the way her tattoos flickered with each passing moment. He reached across the table, his hand brushing hers. Her glow steadied under his touch. We'll get through this, he said, his voice low but firm. Escheril's eyes met his, and she gave a small, grateful smile. I believe you. After finishing their drinks, Elias led Escheril to the back of the cantina, where they found Marlowe, a stout, gruff-looking man covered in grease and wearing a mechanic's jumpsuit. His small workshop was cluttered with tools and spare parts, and the air smelled of oil and metal. What do you need? Marlowe asked without looking up from the engine he was working on. Fuel and a few supplies, Elias said. Enough to get us off this rock and keep us going for a while. Marlowe grunted, finally lifting his gaze. His eyes narrowed slightly as he took in Escheril, but he said nothing. That'll cost you. Elias handed over a pouch of credits. This enough. Marlowe inspected the payment, then gave a curt nod. Fina, give me an hour. Elias and Escheril stepped outside to wait, the cool mist wrapping around them. They found a quiet spot near the edge of the settlement, where the cliff overlooked a vast expanse of jagged terrain. Escheril sat on a flat rock, her tattoos shimmering softly in the dim light. This place feels empty, she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias sat beside her, his gaze on the horizon. It's not much, but it's quiet. Sometimes that's all you need. Escheril looked at him, her eyes searching. Have you always lived like this? Always running? Elias exhaled slowly, his shoulders sagging slightly. For a long time, yeah. After the wars, there wasn't much left for someone like me. Just one job after another, trying to stay ahead of the mess I left behind. And now? She asked, her voice gentle. Now? He hesitated, his gaze shifting to her. Now it's different. Escheril's tattoos brightened slightly, her warmth radiating in the quiet space between them. She reached out, her fingers lightly tracing the back of his hand. Elias didn't pull away. Instead, he turned his hand over, their palms meeting in a gentle, shared connection. For a moment, the world around them faded, leaving only the steady rhythm of their breathing and the quiet glow of Escheral's light. It was a simple touch, but it carried a weight of unspoken understanding. "We'll find a way," Elias said softly. "Together." Escheral's smile was small but genuine. "Together." The moment was interrupted by the distant sound of engines. Elias's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the horizon. A pair of sleek, black ships descended through the mist, their lights cutting through the gloom. "They've found us," Elias muttered, rising to his feet. Escheril stood beside him, her tattoos flaring with a sense of urgency. "What do we do?" Elias's jaw tightened. "We fight if we have to, but first we run." He grabbed her hand, leading her back toward the freighter as the ships closed in. The quiet sanctuary of the moon was gone, replaced by the growing threat of pursuit. But Elias wasn't about to give up. Not now, not with Escheril by his side. As they reached the ship, Elias turned to Escheril, his expression resolute. "Hold on tight. This is going to get rough." Escheril nodded, her grip on his hand firm. Together, they stepped into the freighter, ready to face whatever came next. The freighter shuddered as it climbed rapidly through the atmosphere, the roar of its engines echoing in the cockpit. Elias gripped the controls tightly, his jaw clenched as he pushed the ship to its limits. Behind him, Escheril stood braced against the doorway, her luminous tattoos flickering in time with the ship's vibrations. "They're gaining on us," she said, her voice calm but tense. Elias glanced at the console, where two red blips were closing in fast. "Yeah, I see them." The pursuing ships were sleek and fast, outfitted with weapons far superior to anything Elias could muster. They had been ready for him, waiting for the moment he'd try to leave the moon. He cursed under his breath. They'd underestimated how far their enemies were willing to go. A warning light flashed on the console, and a sharp beeping filled the cockpit. Elias's stomach sank. "Mi sidambund." Escheral's grip tightened on the doorway. "Can we outrun them?" "Not likely." Elias's fingers flew over the controls, rerouting power to the shields. "Hold on." The freighter banked hard to the right, narrowly avoiding the first missile as it streaked past. The second missile followed, adjusting its trajectory with precision. Elias dove the ship sharply, pulling up just in time to skim the surface of a jagged ridge. The missile detonated against the rocks, the shockwave rattling the freighter. "That was too close," Elias muttered, his heart pounding. Escheril moved closer, her eyes fixed on the console. "What now?" Elias's mind raced. They couldn't keep dodging forever. The enemy ships were faster, better armed, and they knew exactly who they were after. His options were running out. "There's an asteroid field ahead," he said. "We'll use it to shake them." Escheril nodded, her trust in him unwavering. "I'm with you." Elias pushed the engines to full power, the freighter hurtling toward the dense cluster of asteroids visible on the horizon. The pursuing ships followed, their weapons firing in bursts, but Elias maneuvered the freighter skillfully, weaving between the massive rocks. The asteroids loomed larger as they entered the field, the freighter threading its way through the labyrinth of floating debris. Elias focused intently, his hands steady on the controls. The enemy ships hesitated, their pilots forced to slow down to avoid collisions. "We're losing them," Escheril said, a hint of hope in her voice. "Not yet," Elias replied. "They'll regroup." As if on cue, the cockpit was rocked by a sudden impact. Elias cursed, checking the readouts. One of the enemy ships had fired a grappling hook, latching onto the freighter's hull. "They're trying to board us," Escheril said, her tattoos flaring with urgency. Elias growled in frustration. "Get to the engine room. Cut the power to the rear thrusters. We'll shake them off." Escheril didn't hesitate. She dashed out of the cockpit, her light fading as she disappeared down the corridor. Elias focused on the controls, trying to keep the freighter steady as it dragged the enemy ship along. Moments later, the lights flickered, and the rear thrusters powered down. The sudden change in momentum sent the enemy ship swinging wildly. Elias seized the opportunity, steering the freighter hard to the left. The grappling hook snapped, and the enemy ship spun out of control, crashing into a nearby asteroid in a fiery explosion. "One down," Elias muttered. But there was no time to celebrate. The second ship was still on their tail, closing in fast. Escheril returned to the cockpit, her tattoos glowing brighter than before. "The other one's still coming." Elias nodded grimly. "We'll have to fight." He brought the freighter around, facing the incoming ship. Its weapons charged, a pair of plasma cannons glowing ominously. Elias knew the freighter's own weapons were no match for its firepower, but he wasn't about to go down without a fight. "Target their engines," Elias instructed. "If we can slow them down." Before he could finish, a sudden jolt shook the freighter. The second ship had fired a disabling shot, and the freighter's systems began to flicker. Elias fought to maintain control, but the ship was losing power fast. "We're hit," Escheril said, her voice tight. Elias slammed his fist against the console. "Damn it!" The enemy ship closed the distance, its docking clamps extending. Elias's mind raced. If they were boarded, they wouldn't stand a chance against a trained assault team. "Escheril, listen to me," he said urgently. "When they breach the hull, stay behind me. No matter what happens, don't let them take you." Escheril's eyes met his, her tattoos pulsing with determination. "I won't let them take you either." Before Elias could respond, the sound of metal grinding against metal echoed through the ship. The enemy was forcing their way in. Elias drew his blaster, his expression hard as he prepared for the inevitable. The airlock burst open, and a squad of armored soldiers stormed in, their weapons trained on Elias. He fired, taking down the first two, but the others were quick to return fire. Elias ducked behind a console, the air sizzling with energy bolts. Escheril stayed low, her tattoos glowing fiercely as she searched for a way to help. Then, with a sudden burst of light, she moved. Her hand pressed against the console, and her bioluminescence spread across the ship's systems. Sparks flew as the lights flickered and the enemy soldiers stumbled, momentarily disoriented by the surge of energy. Elias seized the moment, stepping out of cover to fire another volley. The remaining soldiers fell, their weapons clattering to the floor. The silence that followed was deafening. Elias lowered his blaster, his breathing heavy. He turned to Escheril, who was leaning against the console, her tattoos dimming as she caught her breath. "You okay?" he asked. She nodded, though she looked exhausted. "I'm fine." Elias crossed the room, placing a hand on her shoulder. "You did good." Escheril managed a faint smile. "We both did." The freighter shuddered again, but this time it was the sound of the enemy ship disengaging. The surviving crew had retreated, likely to regroup. Elias knew it wouldn't be long before they came back with reinforcements. "We need to get out of here," he said, moving back to the controls. "Fast." Escheril joined him, her determination renewed. Together, they powered up the freighter, leaving the asteroid field behind as they plotted a course for the unknown. Their journey was far from over, but for now they had survived. And as the stars stretched out before them, Elias knew they would face whatever came next. Together, the freighter drifted through the quiet expanse of space, its systems running on emergency power. The battle had left the ship battered, and Elias knew they were on borrowed time. He sat in the cockpit, his hands steady on the controls, though his mind was anything but calm. The glow of the damaged console cast flickering shadows across his face. Behind him, Escheril stood silently, her glowing tattoos dim but steady. She had been quiet since the fight, her expression thoughtful as she leaned against the doorway. Elias could feel her eyes on him, her presence a grounding force despite the chaos they had just endured. "We need a place to lay low and make repairs," Elias said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, worn from exhaustion and the weight of their situation. "Problem is, we've got fewer and fewer places to run." Escheril stepped forward, her bare feet barely making a sound on the metal floor. She placed a gentle hand on Elias's shoulder, her touch light but firm. "We'll find a way," she said softly, her voice carrying a quiet strength. "We always do." Elias allowed himself a brief moment to close his eyes, drawing comfort from her words and her touch. She was right, they had faced impossible odds before and survived. Still, the growing danger gnawed at him. The people hunting them were relentless, and each close call only brought them closer to the edge. Escheral's hand lingered for a moment longer before she stepped back. "I can help with the repairs," she offered. "Show me what to do." Elias turned to look at her, his brow furrowing slightly. "You've already done more than enough. You should rest." Her bioluminescence brightened slightly, a soft, determined glow. "I'm not fragile, Elias. I want to help." He regarded her for a moment, then gave a small nod. "All right, I'll show you what needs fixing." They moved together through the ship, their footsteps echoing in the quiet corridors. Elias led her to the engine room, where sparks occasionally sputtered from damaged panels. He pulled a toolkit from a nearby cabinet and handed it to her, his fingers brushing hers in the exchange. The brief contact sent a subtle warmth through him, but he quickly focused on the task at hand. "This conduit here needs rewiring," he said, pointing to a panel that had been partially blown out during the battle. "It's tricky, but if we don't fix it, we'll lose power to the life support systems." Escheril knelt beside the panel, her tattoos casting a soft glow over the damaged wires. She studied the configuration carefully, then began to work with precise, deliberate movements. Elias watched her for a moment, impressed by her focus and determination. She wasn't just surviving, she was adapting, learning to stand alongside him in the fight for their freedom. As she worked, Elias moved to another part of the engine room, inspecting a power relay that had been running hot. The silence between them was comfortable, punctuated only by the occasional hum of machinery or the clink of tools. It was a stark contrast to the chaos they had left behind, and Elias found himself grateful for the reprieve. After a while, Escheril spoke, her voice soft but curious. "How did you learn to do all this?" Elias glanced at her, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Trial and error. When you spend enough time out here, you either figure it out or you don't make it." She nodded, her eyes meeting his briefly before returning to her work. "You've been running for a long time." "Yeah," Elias said quietly, his smile fading. "Too long." There was a pause. Then Escheril set down her tools and turned to face him fully. "You're not running alone anymore." Her words hung in the air, simple but profound. Elias met her gaze, the faint glow of her tattoos reflecting in his eyes. For a moment, the weight of his past and the uncertainty of their future seemed to lift, replaced by the quiet understanding they shared. "I know," he said softly, "and I'm glad." They finished the repairs together, their combined efforts bringing the freighter systems back to a more stable state. When the last panel was secured, Elias leaned against the wall, wiping a hand across his forehead. "That should hold for now," he said. Escheril stood beside him, her expression calm but resolute. "What's our next move?" Elias thought for a moment, then pushed off the wall. "There's an old contact of mine in the Veleron sector. He owes me a favor. If he's still around, he might have what we need." Escheril nodded, her trust in him evident. "Then let's go." They returned to the cockpit, where Elias set a course for the Veleron sector. As the ship began to move once more, Escheril settled into the seat beside him, her presence a steady, comforting light in the darkness of space. For a while, they sat in companionable silence, watching the stars streak past the viewport. Then, without looking at him, Escheril spoke again. "You've risked everything for me. I want you to know that I don't take that lightly." Elias glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "I couldn't just stand by and let them take you," he said. "No one deserves that." She turned to him, her luminous eyes searching his face. "It's more than that. You've given me a chance to live, to hope. I owe you my life." Elias shook his head. "You don't owe me anything, Escheril. We're in this together. That's all that matters." A faint smile touched her lips, and her tattoos brightened briefly in response. She reached out, her hand resting lightly on his. "Together," she repeated. The quiet connection between them deepened, a bond forged through shared struggle and trust. Elias felt the warmth of her touch, the steady pulse of her light matching the rhythm of his heartbeat. In that moment, the vastness of the galaxy seemed to shrink, leaving only the two of them and the unspoken promise they shared. As the freighter continued its journey, Elias knew their fight was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he felt a sense of purpose, a reason to keep going. Whatever lay ahead, they would face it together. The freighter docked with a low groan at a hidden outpost in the Veleron sector, its exterior battered but holding together. The small station was little more than a cluster of interconnected modules clinging to the side of a massive asteroid. It wasn't on any official charts, which made it the perfect refuge for people like Elias and Escherel. Elias shut down the engines and rose from the pilot's seat, stretching out the tension in his shoulders. He glanced at Escherel, who stood beside him, her luminous tattoos casting soft patterns across the dim cockpit. Her calm demeanor belied the danger they had just escaped, but Elias could see the strain in her eyes. "We'll be safe here for a while," Elias said, his voice low but steady. "I know a guy who can help us get what we need." Escherel nodded, her gaze lingering on the viewport. "And if he can't?" Elias's mouth tightened into a thin line. "Then we find another way." They descended the freighter's ramp into the station's main corridor, a narrow passage dimly lit by flickering lights. The air was stale, heavy with the scent of metal and machinery. As they moved deeper into the station, Elias led the way, his hand never straying far from the blaster at his side. At the far end of the corridor, a heavy steel door slid open with a hiss, revealing a small workshop cluttered with tools and parts. A tall, lean man with a weathered face and sharp eyes looked up from his workbench. His gaze flicked to Elias, and a smirk tugged at the corner of his mouth. "Well, if it isn't Elias Vren," the man said, his voice laced with dry amusement. "Thought you'd fallen off the grid for good." "Good to see you too, Garan," Elias replied, stepping inside. "Y me da favor." Garen's smirk widened. "Of course you do. You always show up when you need something." Elias gestured to the freighter visible through the workshop's viewport. "She's in bad shape. I need parts and fuel, and I need them fast." Garen raised an eyebrow, his gaze shifting to Escherel. His smirk faded slightly as he took in her unusual appearance and the soft glow of her tattoos. "And who's your friend?" Escherel met his gaze calmly, her voice steady. "My name is Escherel." Garen gave a slow nod, then turned back to Elias. "This favor just got a lot more interesting." Elias stepped closer, his tone firm. "She's with me. That's all you need to know." Garen held up his hands in mock surrender. All right. No need to get testy." He leaned against the workbench, his sharp eyes narrowing. "I can get you what you need, but it won't be cheap. Supplies are tight, and you've got a knack for bringing trouble." Elias crossed his arms, his jaw set. "I'll pay whatever it takes." Garen studied him for a moment, then gave a short nod. "Fine, I'll start pulling what I've got. Give me a few hours." Elias turned to Escherel. "Let's get some rest while we wait." They found a small, empty room near the workshop, its walls bare except for a narrow bunk and a worn metal table. The door slid shut behind them, sealing out the hum of the station's machinery. Escherel sat on the edge of the bunk, her hands resting lightly in her lap. Her tattoos pulsed gently, reflecting the quiet tension between them. Elias leaned against the wall, his arms crossed. "Garen's a pain, but he'll come through." Escherel nodded, her eyes thoughtful. "You trust him." "As much as I trust anyone out here," Elias said. "We've got history. He's helped me out of tight spots before." She glanced down at her hands, her voice soft. "We've been running for so long. Sometimes it feels like there's no end to it." Elias pushed off the wall, moving to sit beside her on the bunk. He placed a hand on her shoulder, his touch steady and grounding. "There is an end," he said quietly. "We just have to keep pushing until we find it." Escherel looked up at him, her luminous eyes meeting his. For a moment, the weight of their shared struggles seemed to lift, leaving only the connection between them. She reached up, her fingers lightly brushing his hand. Her touch was warm, her light pulsing softly in time with his heartbeat. "Thank you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "For everything." Elias's gaze softened, and he gave her shoulder a gentle squeeze. "You don't have to thank me. We're in this together." The room fell into a comfortable silence, the steady hum of the station providing a distant backdrop. Escherel leaned slightly against him, her presence a quiet reassurance. Elias closed his eyes for a moment, letting the exhaustion of their journey catch up with him. After a while, Escherel shifted, her voice breaking the silence. "Do you ever wonder what it would be like to stop running? To just live?" Elias opened his eyes, his expression thoughtful. "Yeah, I think about it more than I'd like to admit." She turned to face him, her tattoos glowing softly. "Do you think we'll ever find that?" Elias met her gaze, his resolve firm. "If we keep fighting for it, yeah. Bido." A faint smile touched her lips, and she leaned in slightly, her proximity filling the small space with warmth. Elias felt his heartbeat quicken, but he didn't pull away. The quiet intimacy between them grew, unspoken but undeniable. Before either of them could say more, a chime echoed through the room, signaling an incoming message. Elias stood, moving to the console on the wall. He pressed a button, and Garen's voice crackled through the speaker. "Elias, I've got your parts. Come to the workshop when you're ready." Elias glanced back at Escheril, his expression determined. "Looks like it's time to move." She rose from the bunk, her tattoos brightening slightly. "Let's finish this." Together, they left the room, ready to face whatever came next. As they made their way back to Garen's workshop, Elias couldn't shake the feeling that their fight was far from over. But with Escheril by his side, he knew they stood a chance against whatever dangers lay ahead. Elias and Escheril moved quickly through the dim corridors of the outpost, the hum of its aging systems a constant backdrop. The freighter was nearly ready for departure, its systems patched and fueled thanks to Garen's efforts. But Elias couldn't shake the sense of unease that had settled over him since their arrival. The station felt too quiet, its usual buzz of activity muted. They reached Garen's workshop, where the mechanic was hunched over a terminal, his fingers flying across the keys. He looked up as they entered, his expression grim. "Got everything set for you," Garen said, gesturing to a pile of crates filled with supplies. "But we've got a problem." Elias's eyes narrowed. "What kind of problem?" Garen tapped a few keys, bringing up a grainy screen showing an incoming ship. The sleek, predatory design was unmistakable. "That's a Vanguard-class cruiser," Garen said. "They're not here for a friendly visit." Escherel's tattoos flared slightly as she stepped closer. "They've found us." Elias's jaw clenched. "How much time do we have?" "Not enough," Garen said. "They'll be in range within minutes. If you want to get out of here, you need to move now." Elias turned to Escheril, his mind racing. "Get to the ship. Start pre-flight. I'll handle the supplies." Escheril hesitated for a moment, her glowing gaze locked on his. Then she nodded, her determination clear. "Be careful." She slipped out of the workshop, her lithe form disappearing down the corridor. Elias moved quickly, loading the crates onto a hovercart. Garen helped, his usual sarcasm replaced by a focused urgency. "You've really kicked the hornet's nest this time," Garen muttered. Elias gave a grim smile. "Wouldn't be the first time." They finished loading the last of the supplies when the station's lights flickered, followed by a low, ominous hum. Garen cursed under his breath. "They're hacking into the station's systems. Once they're in, they'll lock everything down." Elias grabbed the hovercart's controls. "Then we don't give them the chance." He pushed the cart out of the workshop, Garen following close behind. As they navigated the narrow corridors, the station's speakers crackled to life, a cold, authoritative voice echoing through the halls. "This is Commander Varek of the Dominion Fleet. Surrender the fugitive, and no harm will come to the rest of the station." Elias snorted. "Same speech, different day." Garen shot him a look. "You've dealt with this guy before?" "Not personally, but I know his type," Elias said. He won't stop until he gets what he wants. They reached the docking bay, where Escherel was already at the freighter's controls. The ship's engines hummed with power, ready for a quick escape. Elias guided the hovercart up the ramp, securing the supplies in the cargo hold. Garan stayed at the base of the ramp, his expression tense. "This is where we part ways," Garan said. "But if you survive, try not to bring this kind of heat my way again." Elias gave a short nod. "Thanks, Garan. You've done more than enough." Garan smirked, then turned and disappeared into the shadows of the docking bay. Elias closed the ramp and made his way to the cockpit, where Escherel was already working through the pre-flight sequence. "They're hailing us," she said, her voice calm but edged with tension. Elias slid into the pilot's seat, his hands moving over the controls. "Ignore it. They're just trying to stall us." The freighter lifted off the docking platform, its engines rumbling as it maneuvered toward the station's exit. On the radar, the Vanguard-class cruiser loomed closer, its weapon systems coming online. "They're charging weapons," Escherel said, her gaze fixed on the readouts. "Let them," Elias replied, his focus razor-sharp. "We'll be out of here before they can get a lock." The freighter shot forward, weaving through the station's outer structures. The cruiser fired, but the freighter's smaller size and agility allowed it to evade the incoming blasts. Elias guided the ship into a dense asteroid field, using the rocky debris as cover. The cruiser followed, its sleek frame navigating the asteroids with alarming precision. Elias pushed the freighter harder, his hands steady on the controls as they twisted and turned through the field. Escherel monitored their pursuer, her tattoos glowing brightly with the intensity of the moment. "They're gaining," she said. Elias's mind raced. He needed to outmaneuver them, to find a way to put enough distance between them to make a jump to hyperspace. Then an idea struck him. "Hold on," he said. He angled the freighter toward a particularly dense cluster of asteroids, aiming for a narrow gap between two massive rocks. The cruiser followed, its weapons firing in rapid bursts. Elias waited until the last possible moment, then pulled the freighter into a sharp climb, skimming the surface of one of the asteroids. The cruiser wasn't as fortunate. Its larger frame clipped the edge of the asteroid, sending it spinning off course. Sparks and debris erupted from its hull as it struggled to regain control. "Now's our chance," Elias said, inputting the coordinates for their jump. Engaging hyperdrive. The freighter's engines roared as it accelerated, the stars outside the viewport stretching into streaks of light. Moments later, they were in hyperspace, the threat of the cruiser left far behind. Elias leaned back in his seat, letting out a slow breath. His hands ached from gripping the controls, but the tension in his chest began to ease. Escherel sat beside him, her glowing tattoos slowly dimming as the immediate danger passed. "We made it," she said softly, her voice filled with both relief and quiet determination. Elias turned to her, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Yet, for now, they sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the hyperdrive filling the cockpit. Then, without a word, Escherel reached over, her hand resting lightly on Elias's. Her touch was warm, her light pulsing gently beneath her skin. Elias looked at her, the connection between them stronger than ever. In the vast emptiness of space, they had found something to hold on to each other. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. The freighter emerged from hyperspace into a quiet sector of space, far from any major trade routes or inhabited systems. The stars here were distant and cold, casting a faint, silvery light over the endless void. Elias scanned the sensors, ensuring they were alone before leaning back in his seat with a relieved sigh. "We've bought ourselves some time," he said, glancing at Escherel. "No sign of pursuit." Escherel nodded, her tattoos glowing softly in the dim light of the cockpit. "They'll keep searching," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "But we'll be ready." Elias admired her composure. Despite everything they had endured, she remained steady, her determination unwavering. She had grown since the day he first saw her in chains. No longer just a frightened captive but a partner, someone who shared the burden of their fight for freedom. He stood and stretched, his muscles aching from hours at the controls. "We should check the damage from that last run," he said. "See what we're dealing with." Escherel rose as well, her gaze following him as he moved toward the freighter's rear compartments. Together, they inspected the ship systems, their movements efficient and synchronized. Elias checked the power relays while Escherel monitored the shield generators, her glowing fingers dancing over the console's controls. "The shields took a hit, but the core's intact," she reported, her tattoos pulsing in rhythm with the hum of the generator. "Good," Elias said, nodding in approval. "We'll reinforce them when we get the chance. For now, they'll hold." They worked in silence for a while, the tension of the earlier battle gradually easing as they focused on the tasks at hand. When they finished, Elias led the way back to the living quarters. The small space felt more like home now, its once sterile atmosphere softened by the quiet warmth of their shared presence. Elias sank onto the edge of the bunk, his shoulders sagging as exhaustion caught up with him. Escherel sat beside him, her proximity a comfort. For a moment, neither of them spoke, the weight of their journey hanging heavy in the air. "You've been running for a long time," Escherel said softly, her luminous eyes fixed on him. "Haven't you?" Elias exhaled slowly, his gaze dropping to the floor. "Yeah," he admitted. "Longer than I care to remember." Escherel reached out, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Her touch was gentle, a quiet reassurance that spoke louder than words. "And now?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elias looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "Now it feels different," he said. "I'm not just running anymore. I'm fighting for something, someone." Escherel's tattoos brightened slightly, a soft glow spreading across her skin. She leaned in, her voice steady and filled with quiet resolve. "You're not alone in this, Elias. We fight together." The intensity of her gaze, the warmth of her presence, filled the small room with a sense of connection that went beyond words. Elias reached up, his hand lightly brushing against her cheek. Her skin was cool and smooth, her glow pulsing softly under his touch. "I know," he said quietly, "and that means more than I can say." Escherel smiled, her eyes shimmering with unspoken emotion. For a moment, the dangers they faced seemed distant, the vastness of the galaxy shrinking to the space between them. She leaned closer, her forehead lightly resting against his, their breaths mingling in the quiet. Elias closed his eyes, savoring the closeness, the sense of belonging he hadn't felt in years. In this fleeting moment, they were safe, two souls finding solace in each other amidst the chaos of their lives. The soft chime of the ship's proximity alert broke the silence, pulling them back to the present. Elias straightened, his hand falling away as he moved toward the console. "Something's coming," he said, his tone sharp as he scanned the readouts. Escherel joined him, her tattoos dimming slightly as she focused. "What is it?" Elias's brow furrowed. "It's not a ship. It's a signal." He adjusted the controls, isolating the frequency. The signal was faint but persistent, a repeating sequence of numbers and tones. Elias worked quickly, deciphering the pattern until a set of coordinates appeared on the screen. "It's a message," he said, his voice laced with curiosity. "From an old resistance outpost." Escherel leaned closer, her eyes narrowing. "Do you think it's a trap?" Elias considered for a moment, then shook his head. "Could be, but it's a risk we might have to take. If the outpost is still active, they could have resources, allies." Escherel nodded, her resolve clear. "Then we go." Elias set the new course, the freighter turning toward the distant coordinates. As they prepared for the journey, a renewed sense of purpose filled the cockpit. The path ahead was uncertain, but they were no longer drifting aimlessly. They had a direction, a goal, and together they would see it through. As the freighter slipped back into hyperspace, Elias glanced at Escherel. Her calm determination, her quiet strength, had become a beacon in his life. No matter what lay ahead, he knew they would face it side by side. And for the first time in years, that was enough. The freighter dropped out of hyperspace into a system filled with the faint glow of a dying star. The coordinates from the signal led to a barren planet orbiting close to the dim light, its surface scarred by ancient impacts. Elias studied the planet's readout from the cockpit, his fingers drumming lightly on the console. "Looks like a graveyard," he muttered. Escheril stood beside him, her gaze fixed on the planet below. Her tattoos flickered faintly, reflecting her inner thoughts. "If the outpost is still operational, it'll be underground," she said. "Hidden from scans." Elias nodded. "Makes sense. We'll have to land and find the entrance on foot." He piloted the freighter into the planet's thin atmosphere, guiding it toward a flat, rocky plain near the signal's origin. The landing gear groaned as it settled onto the uneven ground, dust and debris swirling around the ship. Once the engines powered down, Elias grabbed his blaster and a small scanning device, checking the charge on both. Escheril was already preparing, her movements precise as she secured a light pack over her shoulder. "Ready?" he asked. She met his gaze, her expression calm but resolute. "Always." They descended the ramp, the planet's surface stretching out before them in desolate silence. The air was thin and cold, carrying the metallic tang of dust. Elias activated the scanner, watching as the device mapped the terrain, highlighting a series of faint energy signatures beneath the rocky surface. "This way," he said, leading Escheril toward the strongest signal. They moved carefully, their boots crunching over the brittle ground. The landscape was littered with jagged rocks and the remnants of ancient structures, their weathered forms barely distinguishable from the natural formations around them. The oppressive quiet was broken only by the occasional gust of wind, a low, mournful sound that seemed to echo through the empty expanse. As they neared the signal, Elias slowed, his scanner beeping steadily. "We're close," he said, gesturing to a large rock formation ahead. Escheril's tattoos brightened slightly as she scanned the area with her eyes. "There," she said, pointing to a narrow crevice in the rock. Elias approached the crevice, finding a concealed panel embedded in the stone. He brushed away the dust and activated the scanner again, which confirmed a faint power source behind the rock face. With a few adjustments, he managed to trigger the panel, and the hidden door slid open with a low, grinding sound. Beyond the door lay a dark tunnel, its walls reinforced with aged metal. Elias drew his blaster, stepping cautiously inside. Escheril followed, her glow providing a soft light that illuminated their path. The tunnel descended steeply, the air growing colder with each step. The silence was heavier here, the faint hum of distant machinery the only indication that the outpost still functioned. They moved carefully, their senses alert for any signs of danger. At the end of the tunnel, they found a large, reinforced door. Elias examined the control panel beside it, his fingers hovering over the buttons. "Looks like we need a code," he said, frowning. Before he could try to bypass the system, the door suddenly hissed open, revealing a dimly lit chamber beyond. Elias raised his blaster, his grip tightening as he scanned the room. "Welcome," a voice said, calm but authoritative. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing a tattered resistance uniform. His face was lined with age and experience, his sharp eyes assessing Elias and Escheril with practiced ease. "We've been expecting you," the man said, his gaze lingering on Escheril. "You're the one from the Elysian Nebula." Escheril's tattoos dimmed slightly, her expression cautious. "You know who I am?" The man nodded. "We've heard the transmissions. Your escape from the Dominion has sparked hope among the scattered resistance cells. You've become a symbol." Elias lowered his blaster slightly but kept it at the ready. "Who are you?" The man turned his attention to Elias, a faint smile on his lips. "Commander Kale Rin. I led the resistance out of this sector when the Dominion first tightened its grip. This outpost is one of the last refuges for those still fighting." Elias exchanged a glance with Escheril, then lowered his weapon fully. "We could use some allies." Kale nodded. "And we could use your help. The Dominion's hold is weakening in some areas, but they're doubling down in others. With your knowledge of their movements and her abilities," he gestured to Escheril, "we might finally tip the balance." Escheril stepped forward, her voice steady. "We didn't come here to hide. We want to fight." Kale's smile grew. "Then you've come to the right place." He led them deeper into the outpost, where other resistance members worked at various terminals, their focus intense. The chamber buzzed with quiet determination, a stark contrast to the desolation above. Kale stopped at a central console, pulling up a holographic map of the sector. "The Dominion's stronghold in this system is their communications hub. If we take it out, we cut off their ability to coordinate reinforcements." Elias studied the map, his mind already working through the logistics. "It won't be easy," he said. "They'll have heavy defenses." Kale nodded. "That's why we'll need both of you. Escheral's abilities can disrupt their systems, and your combat experience will be crucial." Escheral's tattoos flared briefly as she placed a hand on the console. "Who is he?" Elias looked at her, seeing the fire in her eyes, the unwavering resolve. He nodded, a sense of purpose settling over him. "Let's get to work." The next few hours were spent in preparation, gathering supplies and finalizing their plan. The mission would be dangerous, but it was a chance to strike a decisive blow against the Dominion. As they stood together in the ready room, Elias and Escheril shared a quiet moment. The weight of their journey had brought them to this point, and though the path ahead was fraught with peril, they were no longer running. They were fighting for something bigger, for freedom, for hope, and for each other. Elias reached out, his hand brushing against Escheril's. Her glow brightened in response, a silent promise passing between them. "No matter what happens," Elias said, his voice low, "we face it together." Escheril nodded, her eyes shining. "Together." With that, they turned toward the mission ahead, ready to face whatever the stars had in store.